This video acts as both an in-depth look at the Escapist and also a partial reply to some of the topics Sargon of Akkad brought up during his own Escapist video. For those of you who haven't seen Sargon's video, I recommend you go take a look. It's great stuff. However, let me quickly recap the Escapist's involvement in Gamergate up until now. The Escapist was one of the only websites that refused to censor discussion of the Zoe post back in August 2014, despite what we would later learn to be large amounts of pressure on Greg Tito, the Escapist's editor-in-chief, to do so. Pressure that originated from Ben Kuchera and other members of the cabal that made up the Game Journal Pro's mailing list. The Escapist very quickly updated its ethics policy in response to Gamergate. Alexander Macris published on the Escapist a rebuttal to the coordinated Gamers Are Dead attack articles, stating that gamers are indeed not dead. Greg Tito himself published a similar article called Why I Still Call Myself a Gamer. And with the recent hiring of Brandon Morse and Lizzie F., two very pro-Gamergate individuals, as well as rumblings of also bringing Oliver Campbell on board, everyone's throwing their hats in the air and talking about how this is a major victory for Gamergate. I understand all you guys' enthusiasm, and I don't want to be a wet blanket, but let's take a step back and look at this with a critical eye. Yes, it's good that anti-gamer individuals like Jim Sterling and the notoriously stupid Movie Bob have been given the boot from the Escapist. The rhetoric they peddled was ultimately about using misogyny as a tool to cover up unethical conduct, something that a journalist site based on ethics should not be endorsing. But what about Greg Tito? Greg Tito's a hard guy to read in my opinion. I have no doubt he's a good guy, as a lot of people have attested to, but he was let go from the Escapist as well, and replaced with an editor-in-chief that seems to be very, very openly pro-gamer, which is what you want to see at the head of a gaming publication. During the roundtable discussion Tito had with Total Biscuit, Janelle Bonanno, and Eric Kanan on October 6th, he seemed to paint himself as being against Gamergate. Not outwardly or obviously, and certainly not in an inflammatory or harassing manner, but his tone, his comments regarding other journalists, all pointed toward a person who didn't support GG. In a post on Innuendo Studios' Tumblr, describing why they left the Escapist, he talks about a phone call with Tito. Alex Macris, whom I mentioned earlier as having published articles on the Escapist, works for the Escapist's parent company Defy Media. Essentially, he was Greg Tito's boss, and he was behind publishing the two pieces outlining various developers' feelings on Gamergate. Were Tito's superiors at Defy Media pro-Gamergate, and they butted heads with their anti-Gamergate editor-in-chief enough that they simply decided to let him go? It's a possibility. It's also a possibility that Greg Tito's Why I Still Call Myself a Gamer article was actually heartfelt. In any case, somebody somewhere was putting the squeeze on Tito. If he was pro-Gamergate, the cabal was pressuring him. If he was anti-Gamergate, his bosses were probably pressuring him. The most likely story is that he was neutral and taking it from everybody. But is the Escapist pro-Gamergate? Defy Media pulled the plug on writing about Gamergate after the backlash that the developer interviews received. They weren't censoring discussion, but they also weren't reporting on it anymore. The post on Innuendo Studios' Tumblr says it the best. If you want to talk ethics, let's talk about this. A news site is forbidden by corporate from covering a major topic in gaming, and both site and parent company have come away thinking that all controversial content is bad. And what's really interesting is an article on the Escapist published in 2005 by Jennifer Buckendorf called Gamer Like Me. Despite being from nearly 10 years before Gamergate, it reads exactly like the Gamers Are Dead articles, complete with Buckendorf saying, maybe the whole concept of a gamer is outdated, a remnant from 5 years ago. Of course, that was from 2005. It was the last thing Buckendorf ever published on The Escapist, and after writing similar SJW-styled pieces for such outlets as Salon, she eventually left journalism to go work at Amazon. And the anti-Gamergaters, along with Greg Tito, assuming he wasn't an anti himself, have all been given the boot as well. Perhaps the issue is time. The Escapist was once anti-GG, and with policy revisions and shakeups, it's been slowly swinging pro over the past 6 months. However, at this point, there's still a significant possibility that these changes are political rather than substantive. To me, this feels like people being pro-GG or anti-GG for the sake of perpetuating their chosen banner, while not actually caring about what that means. In short, if Gamergate is about ethics, then staff shakeups at the Escapist shouldn't necessarily be a cause for celebration. No offense to Lizzie or Brandon or Oliver or Leanna Kay, but it's not your hiring that should matter to Gamergate, but rather you're performing your jobs in an ethical manner. And no offense to you, Sargon, but I disagree with you when you say that this is a decisive victory. Why? Because to be pro-Gamergate not only means to support ethical standards, but to adhere to them yourself if you're a publication. And, in my opinion, the Escapist still has some problems. Let's go back to Innuendo Studios' Tumblr post. The news site is forbidden by corporate from covering a major topic is troubling enough. However, on the phone call, Greg Tito explained that the Gamergate pieces featuring interviews with developers was pushed through editorial with less oversight than usual, likely on account of it being written by Alex Macris, Greg Tito's boss. I don't think that any of us over here at the Short Fight Otaku channel exist in an echo chamber. We read stuff we don't agree with because it's always good to have your ideas challenged. Which is why I reread the post on Zoe Quinn's blog, Let's Talk About Ethics in Games Journalism. Yes, Zoe Quinn wrote a blog post about ethics in games journalism. I have a feeling that nobody in Gamergate noticed it because they all died from laughter after seeing the title. However, she actually makes some very good points. There's a section where Zoe decries Gamergate holding up the Escapist as a paragon of integrity, as she lists off various ethical violations that GG is, according to her, ignoring. Let's take a look at these violations. On the first iteration of the What Male Game Developers Think of Gamergate article, the one that Alex Macros pushed through with little editing oversight, there's a quotation from James Desborough, a developer. Editor's Note 3 claims that his portion of the article was removed due to claims of harassment. However, looking at the logs of the Burgers and Fries IRC channel, which is where the harassment was alleged to have taken place, shows that this isn't the case whatsoever. At the same time, Alex Macros is a backer to Desborough's project, something that Desborough pointed out on his private blog that the Escapist should have disclosed. It seems odd to me that Desborough's quote would be removed from the article under the pretense of harassment that he never committed. Zoe also brings up this piece on the Escapist, a 2011 holiday buyer's guide. Of note is the second recommendation. Adventure Conqueror King System. A full paragraph describes the game and recommends it to the reader, and the review is quite positive. Nowhere on this piece is it disclosed that Adventure Conqueror King System was designed by Alex Macros and Greg Tito. Maybe I'm making a mountain out of a molehill. Maybe I'm seeing things that aren't there, or treading over old ground that's already been resolved at some location that I haven't been able to find. All of these examples of unethical conduct over at the Escapist are, in fact, old happenings. But so were Patricia Hernandez's infractions, and we were entirely willing to call for her job when we discovered her unethical behaviors, despite them happening years ago. We can't play favorites. If it's not okay for Hernandez to do, even several years after the fact, then it also can't be okay for Macros to do several years after the fact either. We can't simply ignore Macros' conduct and hand-wave the ethical infractions because it happened a few years ago, if we're still so insistent on holding responsible, say, Ian Miles Cheong for all the neo-Nazi shit he said back when he was an edgy try-hard teenage emo kid. We can't demand only part of this industry to own up to offenses happened in the past, while giving the other part a free pass due to it being a little while, all because we like one group politically more than the other. Just as a side point, let's quickly check out what Zoe's got to say about ethics in games journalism beyond just her comments on The Escapist. A lot of it is blaming Gamergate for various forms of harassment rather than actually discussing ethics, and nobody's surprised at that. It's the same propaganda regurgitated from the depths of her Blockbot-enforced echo chamber that we're all used to hearing at this point. Zoe links to a Storyfy entitled Gamergate Supports Jack Thompson. Sounds pretty damning, right? The page is a collection of pro-GG tweets coming out and saying Jack Thompson is cool, with the header picture being from a recent interview. Jay Allen says, Jack Thompson criticized Sarkeesian, so now Gamergate loves him. Yeah, this actually does sound kind of damning. But let's watch the interview.
The bright red line for me has always been that adult entertainment should be available to adults. Under the First Amendment, they can get it, but that it should not be available to anyone under that age of adulthood, which is at 18, or as it applies to the video game rating, under 17. It's surprising how many hardcore gamers, once they hear that's my position, agree with me. So no, I'm not for censorship. I believe in a free society, adults should be able to get adult material.
That does in fact sound reasonable. There's one of three possibilities here. 1. Jack Thompson's being duplicitous. 2. Jack Thompson changed his tune over the years. Or 3. Jack Thompson was misunderstood back in the day. And yes, Thompson does have something to say about Anita Sarkeesian.
Well, there's a little thing that I'm not sure she's fully aware of, and that's called the First Amendment.
But what is it that made Gamergate warm up to him? A 5-second clip where he says Anita's not familiar with the importance of free speech in a civilized society? Or the longer portion, where he describes his position on games and denounces censorship? It was probably both. However, I'm going to place greater importance on his discussion of the censorship of our industry, and the clarification of his position, rather than a tiny potshot taken at a woman not even involved in Gamergate. At this point, the anti-gamers are completely inverting in on themselves. They slander Gamergate with the specter of Jack Thompson, specifically because Jack Thompson was given an opportunity to say he's not actually interested in censoring games, and we believed him. Meanwhile, they actually want to censor games by trying to get Hatred or Honeypop off Steam, getting Target to pull GTA 5 from store shelves, and our good friend Full Macintosh destroying games and declaring the industry to be depraved, claiming that Smash Brothers causes violence and conflicts, while his good pal Ben Kuchera in the same Twitter thread says that Tetris is Soviet propaganda because it has a Russian song in it. After seeing that bout of insanity, I actually have no problem being associated with Jack Thompson. Zoe also has a passage on TechRaptor. Let's take a peek. Zoe says that TechRaptor cited an Imager link that was so hilariously asinine that Zoe took it as her new company name. Well, that's great, Zoe, but you haven't actually shown why the content of the link was asinine. You're offering no refutation. You're simply trying to discredit it through mockery. Zoe says that TechRaptor used a Reddit comment as a single source to publish serious accusations of sabotage. Here she's referring to the Fine Young Capitalist post on Reddit, describing how their game jam was blacklisted from being reported on due to Zoe's influence. Meanwhile, the article she links talks about many different topics, none of which Zoe comments on but the one. Zoe, you're right in that they used a single source from Reddit, but the source checked out, and you're, again, not proving any evidence to the contrary. Zoe says that TechRaptor publishes articles riddled with basic syntax and grammar errors. Looking at her example, she's right. Zoe posts an image showing that the people at TechRaptor don't know what the concept of death of the author means. Again, she's right. Zoe links to TechRaptor's ethics policy and says it's missing some parts of the code of ethics on the Society of Professional Journalists website, as well as sounding more like a list of Gamergate talking points. Again, she's right. But neither the ethics pages nor the real-world behaviors of the publications Gamergate is boycotting line up with this code either. Zoe goes on to complain that Georgina Young corrected articles she made mistakes on as new facts came to light. Does anybody need to have it explained to them why this is ridiculous? Corrections and clarifications and disclosures are what we want. It's always unfortunate when new information comes out that renders an article obsolete. However, it crosses the line from unfortunate to unethical when the publication simply marches on and refuses to publicly discuss their mistake. TechRaptor doesn't do that. Zoe, your chosen sites do. She claims a retweet of an advertisement from Stardoc's Twitter, by TechRaptor's Twitter, is a conflict of interest, when I am only able to find TechRaptor's interviewing Stardock CEO Brad Wardell, and certainly no TechRaptor hosted reviews of his games. She claims TechRaptor accepting donations from prominent Gamergaters is a conflict of interest, since TechRaptor writes about Gamergate. That would make sense if Gamergate were a strictly defined organization that had a unified financial interest. And no offense to Boink, but I've never heard of him before. I'm not sure if he qualifies as prominent. In the end, after looking at what Zoe's got to say about TechRaptor, do I think they're unethical? No. The problems Zoe's outlined regarding TechRaptor that I agree with stem from, and no offense to them, a general incompetence. Things like lack of knowledge or grammar and syntax errors are signs that TechRaptor is experiencing growing pains and needs to up its technical game, not signs that it's an unethical tabloid rag. And the good news is, the problems that TechRaptor have are solved by practice and time. Ethics problems run far deeper. Zoe concludes by bringing up new ethical problems Gamergate has actually created. She brings up campaigns of misinformation and astroturfing, when that is exactly what she and her compatriots in the Cabal have employed as their go-to tactic since long before Gamergate existed. She points at the low score of Depression Quest as an example of vote brigading, while not even recognizing the very likely possibility that her game is just shit and people are voting accordingly. She says that we need to support games writers that aren't strictly journalists, but also opinion writers, critics, academics, and developers. And I wholeheartedly agree, while adding the caveat that not just their opinion writers, their critics, their academics, or their developers need to be heard, but also people who speak for the rest of us as well. She says that we need to discuss standards and ethical expectations of YouTubers in relation to their coverage of games. And again, I agree. She says that we need to make sure that the press we work with are not just fronts by political radicals pushing an agenda, but while she says that hyper-conservatives are guilty of this, I would also add that her hyper-liberal supporters are equally guilty of pushing an agenda.
No pretense of being unbiased. I write about the things I'm interested in, the creators I care about, and the trends that I want to see succeed. Yeah, I have an agenda, sorry.
In the end, Zoe outlined a list of very real concerns, and in doing so, accurately described the behavior of her and her friends. So really, Zoe was actually right, at least some of the time. TechRaptor really is the place to be going forward, but in my opinion, it needs to refine its craft now that it's in the spotlight. The Escapist, meanwhile, certainly seems to be better ethically than the other big-name publications. However, when there's a slip-up, the same two people seem to be involved, either Greg Tito or Alex Macris. And Greg's gone, but Alex isn't. Congratulations to everybody who's currently joining The Escapist, and congratulations to TechRaptor for your newfound success. We've got high hopes for all of you. We all know you'll do a great job. And I hope I didn't offend any of you, or you either, Sargon, for that matter. But, and this should go without saying, We do expect ethical conduct out of you, and I hope you don't think that being pro Gamergate means you're above that. And Alex Macris, maybe you've seen your previous errors and decided to change. Maybe you're behind the Escapist's recent improvements that everyone loves so much. And I hope you have gotten better, and I hope your site continues to thrive. But in my opinion, Gamergate should keep a close eye on the Escapist and Macris' conduct going forward. And based on some of his past decisions, I don't think that's an unreasonable course of action. Also, everybody knows that the Escapist wouldn't even be a thing if it wasn't for Yahtzee anyway.